we're going to, each of the staff members is going to talk about the conferences we went to, and we went to conferences for 1, 2, 6 days, and we're going to summarize in like 7 minutes what we talked about, what we learned in the conferences. So it's going to be really packed, and therefore we're not going to go around and do introductions. And we also have an agenda, so 2 different things that have never happened in the brown bag before. So, and we're going to start. We're delighted to have Margaret Leary in the League of Women Voters. She wants to talk with us about the census.
Thank you very much, Sally. My name is Margaret Leary, and I am here from the local League of Women Voters, the League of Women Voters of the Ann Arbor area. And I want to talk to you about the 2020 census, which is coming up. It will start in March and it will run through June or July of 2020. It is really important, and I'm going to tell you why, and I'm going to tell you the basics about the census. The handouts that I've given you are 2. One is a piece of paper that describes the talk that I can give when I have an hour rather than 10 minutes, which includes a PowerPoint. And if you belong to a group that you think would be interested in this, I have a team of speakers, and I would love to come and talk to your group, me or one of the people on my team. The other handout that I've given you is the same one I use for my long talk. It includes Census 101, which is the important pieces to know about the census. It's 2-sided, and I'll use that as the basis for what I talk to you about. It also includes a page, 2 pages that are about the money that's distributed based on census reports. And a 3rd piece is about the census and confidentiality, which is super, super important. And then an appendix on 50 ways that census data are used other than for distributing federal dollars. And on the last page is a list of where you can find out more information. Okay, first I want to say a few words about the League of Women Voters. We are almost 100 years old. We were formed after women got the right to vote, which was only about 100 years ago. And we now include men in our membership. It's not just women, but we've kept the name League of Women Voters because it's so important that people be able to vote. And as women, we were denied that right for most of the history of our country, and so we've kept that in the name. We are nonpartisan, which means that we neither support nor oppose political candidates or political parties. But that doesn't mean we don't get involved in what people might consider political activities, because we pay a lot of attention to public policy. For example, we were one of the authors of Proposition 3 that was on the ballot last fall, which extended voting rights in 6 different ways and passed by an enormous amount back in November. And we also supported Proposition 2, which succeeded in getting rid of the legislative role in drawing congressional districts, formerly known as gerrymandering. So we do get involved, we study issues, we take sides on issues after we've studied them, and those are 2 examples of what we do. Now about the census. Why is the census so important? The census is important for 4 basic reasons. First of all, it's used to apportion members of Congress among the states. The Constitution requires the census for that purpose. The Constitution in Article 1 requires that every whole person be counted. Every whole person. Person, a word that starts with a P, not with a C. It's not every citizen, it says count every person. It's very, very important that every person be counted, or else our congressional representation will be thrown off base. If a significant percentage of the population does not respond to the census, the numbers are going to be skewed. Michigan has right now 14 members in Congress. At one point, I think we had 18. As our population diminishes in proportion to other states' population, our congressional representation goes down. If every person in Michigan is not counted, our congressional apportionment may be less than what we really deserve. So it's congressional representation is the first reason, and a related reason is that the population count that is taken during the census across the state of Michigan provides information that the Citizen Redistricting Commission will use in 2021 when it draws the lines for the congressional districts in Michigan. So again, if the population count is skewed by an undercount, then those lines will be skewed too. So congressional apportionment and line drawing for election districts is the first big reason the census is important. The second big reason that the census is important is that it's used to distribute billions of dollars in federal aid to all kinds of programs. The details are on the second page of the handout that I've given you, and if you are in a position to influence whether or not people think it's important to respond to the census, you might look over that list. I'm going to name the 4 or 5 biggest uses of the federal money. In Michigan, in fiscal year 2016, 29 billion, in one fiscal year, $29 billion came to the state of Michigan. The biggest uses of that money were for Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, WIC, student loan support, highway construction. But there are many, many, many other uses of money that come to Michigan based on the census count. And again, if we are undercounted, we get fewer dollars. So it's in everybody's interest to respond to the census. The third reason is the role of the information that is gathered in the census, which is basically 6 pieces of information. Your name, your sex, your age, your race, and your ethnic origin are the basics that are asked on the census. It's really pretty simple. And I have another handout here, which is the text, and I can hand that out if anybody's interested. So that information that is gathered by the census is used by public agencies to make all kinds of decisions. For example, the city might use it to decide, where do we need another school? They can see the age of people living in their school district and they say, oh wait, in 10 years we may need another high school. They use it to determine where to put roads. They use it to determine where to put police and fire departments. Also, the private sector uses the information for a wide variety of purposes. Businesses, again, to decide what their customer base might be, where to put another store. And of course, scholars and academics and genealogists use the information gathered from the census to look up information. A final point about the census is that it is confidential. People may be fearful of responding because they worry that the government will get hold of their information and use it for nefarious purposes or perhaps legal purposes. The census by federal statute is confidential, secret. You can get fined $250,000 and put in jail if you're a census worker and you disclose information. They take a lifetime oath, lifetime, not just while they're working for the Census Bureau, but forever. The information about individuals cannot be disclosed for 72 years after the census. So most of us will not be around when our information is. That's why in Ancestry.com you can't find anything about an individual after 1940, okay? So it's confidential. That's really important. The final point I want to make in my last minute is that I am eager to give either this short version or a long version of my talk to any group. The League of Women Voters is especially interested in encouraging the groups that tend not to reply. That means minorities, undocumented people, people with less education, people with lower income, children. Children are grossly undercounted in the census, and college students. So if you have any ins with those groups, I'm particularly interested, but I'm happy to give the talk to anybody. Our problem as the League of Women Voters is we don't look very much like any of the groups that I just named. We're certainly not children. But I'm eager to give the talk, and I have a PowerPoint that goes along with it. The long version of the talk takes about 25 minutes, and I usually get at least 20 or 25 minutes of questions. So ideally an hour, but if I can get 10 minutes, I take it. I give you back 1 minute. And I'm going to have to excuse myself, I'm very sorry.
And I thought this was so important that I thought we should get it in now, because I also thought some of you might want to be what I call census takers.
Oh, yes.
Margaret told me that they are no longer called census takers, they're called enumerators.
Right.
And if you want to volunteer to become one of those people, that's the contact.
And that's my tip, my librarian tip. If you forget, Google quote, put your question in quotes, and census jobs, and then site : census.gov. That will give you only census.gov.
And some of us didn't get these.
Okay. Some people didn't get their.
With our table.
All of you. Okay, the important people. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Okay. The next person to speak is Belinda, who's going to talk about why we all got to go to conferences this year, which is what we're going to talk about after you tell us about that.
Okay, hi everybody.
Hi.
I was hoping to give you some context about all of the presentations that you have here today. And also to really express gratitude and appreciation for how we got the ability to attend these conferences. I think all of us up here went to something this year. About 5 years ago, give or take, the coordinated funders, I don't know if you're familiar with them, they are a funding consortium here in Washtenaw County that includes about 6 different entities that donate money for this fund, contribute to this fund, including Washtenaw County, the Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, the United Way, and there's some private foundations that are involved too. The coordinated funders have been around Washtenaw for quite a while, and they always re-examine and assess how they distribute money. So nonprofits apply for grants. You might or might not get it. It's a competitive bidding process that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. About 6 years ago or so, they took note that smaller nonprofits such as the DRC and many others in the county, this county has loosely 1,000 nonprofits. And I hear somewhere between like 850 and 950, so I'm going to say about 1,000 nonprofits. There are a lot of small ones who oftentimes would not get any funding not because our programs weren't good, but because the evaluation of the organization wasn't strong enough. We did not have capacity. There are certain things that we did not have. So a few of us started to appeal to the coordinated funders to say, how can you help us enhance, improve, and increase our capacity so that we can be a more viable bidder on program funds to support our program. And they decided to create a capacity building grant. The DRC applied and was one of the first organizations in the first cohort to receive the money. Then a couple years later, we applied again and got a few more dollars. In total, with both applications, we got about $30,000 to help us increase our capacity. Much of that, and how that looked was that new nonprofit enterprise at work became our business consultant to help, so it wasn't dollars given to the DRC, it was services given to the DRC to help us improve and build our capacity. A lot of the work was done at the board level. Policies, recruitment, best practices, and all of the things that, organizations, nonprofits have to have a board of directors, so we needed some work there. Out of that was a great strategic plan, a multi-year strategic plan. If you've ever gone through that process, it is expensive, which is why we didn't really have one. And we did some other things. Also a part of that request was building capacity around our programs meant that we needed, as a staff, to be able to go to conferences and have these professional development opportunities so that we can know what's happening, what's trending in dispute resolution arena. We know a lot. The DRC staff is extremely competent. We read a lot on our own. We try different things, and there's a lot out there in the internet, but there's nothing like sitting in spaces with colleagues and learning about new ideas, figuring out how we can enhance what we're already doing, making those connections, and we were able to do that thanks to the capacity building grant. I think in my history at the DRC, we've had a little bit of conference time, but I am so proud that we were able to invest in the DRC staff in this way this year. And so the presentations that you're going to hear are from all of the conferences. It was very timely too, because 2019 was the year that ADR was really hot and people were sponsoring, doing their conferences on restorative justice, mediation, and otherwise. So the timing of it worked out perfectly. So I am, again, very grateful that the capacity building dollars are there. If any of you contribute to those organizations, the United Way, Ann Arbor Foundation, just know that we've benefited from your, may have benefited from your contribution to those entities, and I am grateful that they are thinking outside the box a bit on how they can support organizations. It's not always the grant dollars that helps us. We have to be, I'm grateful that they were creative in thinking on how they can support us in our growth in the programs that we're doing. So I wanted to share that to kind of give you some idea of how we got to fly these planes and stay in hotels and go to conferences.
Belinda, you
Yes.
said United Way and Arbor Foundation, what else?
Washtenaw County, and if you Google Washtenaw Coordinated Funders, the other private foundations will pop up too.
Okay, thank you.
So, I haven't added up the amount of time that we spend in conferences, but it is probably 10 days or more. I mean, I'm sure it was 10 days or more. And each of us is going to talk for 7 minutes. Carolyn is timing us, and we're going to have to be quiet after we get to the point where she says stop. And I thought if we ask questions after everybody talks, we won't get to everybody. So if we each talk in order in which we went to workshops, then we'll try to have a half an hour at the end for you to have all the questions for all of us. So write down notes if you want to ask us, if you think of something that you want to ask us. I was lucky, I got to go to 2, so I get to talk twice. I told Germaine we needed 6 chairs, but I realized, no, I don't need 2 chairs, I only need 1. So the first workshop that I went to was called Do Our Own Work, and it's sponsored by the Allies for Change. And Melanie and April live together, and Melanie started this many years ago. And I want to quote a couple of things that she said because I think it's so important for understanding what Allies for Change is and also what Do Your Own Work. She says, allies are people passionately committed to eliminating systems of oppression that unjustly benefit them. So allies are people who unjustly benefit from the systems of oppression. The word ally is not a label that people with privilege can claim for themselves, nor is it a static reality once and for all achieved. People who are targets of oppression determine who their allies are. The activism of those who serve to be allies must always be rooted in humility, collaboration, and accountability. I think that's an absolutely beautiful definition of an ally, and this organization is called Allies for Change. One of the things that they've been doing for many, many years is a program called Do Your Own Work. And it's a 6-day seminar. Sometimes it's done out of town for 6 days in a row. And when it was in that shape, I didn't want to go. But when I found out it was here in Ann Arbor, 2 days a month, locally, I said, this is for me, this is the time for me to go. And it was begun in response to people of color who said that they were tired of white people turning to them and saying, what should I do when this situation arises? Or tell me more about how African American people feel about this or that or the other thing. And they expected to be educated about racism and advised and given advice. And one of the persons of color said, what happens when people of color are not in the room? How are you holding each other accountable? And so they decided that it was really important to have a workshop just for white people an anti-racism workshop, do your own work, and then come back and talk with us. Racism is a white problem, and it's long past time for you all to do your own work. So that's kind of the essence of it. It's not to replace working together with people of color about oppression. That's crucially important, but it's in addition to. Elaine was also there with me. I learned so much when I was there. I learned a lot from the seminar, the curriculum. It was one of the best led seminars I've ever been to. And also from the other participants. We had readings before each weekend. We would have at least 4 articles that we were supposed to read. We didn't always go in depth about the articles, but if we didn't read them, that one might be the one that we needed to go in depth on. So you read the articles. There were a lot of young people in my group, and one of them lives in Detroit in an almost all black neighborhood. And she said that she has noticed that oftentimes the police will pick up African American young men or men, boys, and if she stands in her yard and watches as a witness, they often are released. Sometimes she holds her phone up as if she's taking pictures, but it doesn't seem to matter. Just the fact that a white person is there as a witness can make a real difference in that. Beverly Tatum, one of our readings, was one of the authors, and she talked about how racism, she thinks of it as a walkway at an airport. And if you are walking on the walkway, you are actively racist. And we certainly know that people are, in this day and age, actively racist. And if you are standing there, you're still going in that direction. You're a passive racist. And in order to be an active anti-racist, you have to turn around and walk back faster than the walkway is walking. I think that's a wonderful metaphor. Another metaphor that I have read about since then, which really struck me, and I don't know if I had been to the seminar, it would have stayed with me as long as it had, but Charles Blow, who writes for the New York Times, says, "I am so sick and tired of people saying we're making progress." And he said, this is something that never, ever should have happened. So when you say you're making progress, it's sort of as if someone had stuck a 9-inch knife in your back, and they pull it out 6 inches, and they say, that's progress. And he says, even if it's pulled out all the way, it doesn't ever heal the wound. So any of you who want to go, look up Allies for Change, and it's well worth the time. Miles, you're next.
So Belinda and I had the opportunity to go out to Denver for a Friday, Saturday, Sunday conference and learn from the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. And it was just an all-around excellent conference. There were lots of people there.
About 1,600.
Yeah, so tons of people, lots of breakout sessions, and just crowds to get lost in and people to meet. And you know, just it was really overly positive, overwhelmingly positive being there. They had some great speakers, and they opened things up with Adam Foss, who just, I've said before, set the tone for the entire conference. You know, from that point on. And I just had a great time meeting lots of people that Belinda was able to introduce me to as well. Some funders, some other people that do restorative justice work. So it was great to just have those experiences, and I'm super grateful for that. So I sat in on some pretty interesting sessions. I think there were 2 available breakout sessions each day that you can choose. Well, 2 options on what timing to go to, but there was about 20 plus, maybe 30 options at each time slot that you can choose from. So just never-ending possibilities of what you can go learn about. So it was really hard to actually decide what I wanted to sit in on. But I ended up with, I think, 6 different breakouts. One was called Domestic Violence and Restorative Justice. Another was Serving Crime Victims Through Restorative Justice. The third one, Indigenous Dispute System Design. Uncovering invisible links between diversity, equity, bias, and restorative justice. Colorizing Restorative Justice, Voicing Our Realities, and the final one was Negotiating Power, Dynamics in Restorative Justice Systems, and Restorative Processes. And out of those, I kind of want to focus on 3 of them. They were all great, but 3 kind of had a little bit more pertinent information, I felt. And the first one was that serving victims through restorative justice. And right away, I kind of thought that this is going to be a good session to sit in and get some good information. But yeah, there was just too many things to kind of focus on, honestly, and maybe think about the types of things we're doing here as well. We tend to be focused on the wrongs that are being done to people by the justice system, and we kind of need to reshift our focus and incorporate everybody. We think we might be leaving some parts out, and just focusing on that victim is really, really important, especially from phase number 1. That should be the first person that we're really interacting with and servicing. And they talked about getting the right people on board with that as well. So that's the prosecutors and the victim advocates and things like that. We're able to get in their ear and talk to them about serving victims first, and then I think from that point we can start to kind of expand and help the rest of the people that are involved. But what that kind of looked like was just offering up some opportunities for that person to be able to vent or to grieve, or just talk in general, talk in the open and talk about what happened, and then obviously give them the opportunity to continue on with whatever process they decided at that point. And then that group was called Just Outcomes Consulting. They've got a website which is justoutcomesconsulting.com. They have links to articles, they have some PowerPoints up there with information. I think the 3 people that kind of founded that consulting company are publishing their own kind of things on the website as well, so you can kind of keep up to date with what they've been working on, where they've been. So that was just a really great resource to be able to kind of at least dig down and look at a little different perspective from what I had been kind of traditionally focusing on as we're working on these programs. And the second one I'll mention was the uncovering invisible links between diversity, equity, bias, and restorative justice. And the talk for that was kind of interesting. I think the speaker decided that he was going to go kind of off script. He, on day number 1, got a sense that there was a lot different of conversation that needed to be had. So he kind of switched things up and talked about what needs to be done before you can really start to get into this work, from unpacking your own personal bag and your hidden biases and things like that. So one thing that stuck out to me was he talked about how implicit biases impact the process as a whole, and some of those things are about the questions that we ask and the way we ask them, the language we use in the processes and the circle and mediation, and then the different things we use as prompts and things like that, our circle piece, our talking piece, and all those types of different just aspects that go into the circles, into the processes. We have to be conscious on how we are doing them. Are we doing them from a place of privilege? Are we doing them from a place of bias? We have to really think about that and start to decide, is this going to really provide the best outcome for everybody, or am I just doing things the way I want to do things and not the way people need them to be done, basically. And then they also left us with 4 tips, moving on, just for all kind of dispute resolution professionals, just to get as many trainings as you can with those topics, familiarize yourself with how you act, react, and interact, and then developing an equity lens to manage your programs from, also learning about privilege and power dynamics. And then the last thing they talked about was this conscious conversations, which is calling people in, not calling people out when you hear them talking about something you don't necessarily agree with. Don't put them on the spot, but instead invite them into a conversation and understand where they're thinking from, and then be able to tell them and share with them how your perspective is different, and really just try to use it as a constructive moment, not you did this wrong and now we're going to put you on blast type of thing. And then the final one, since I think my time is coming close, was the Colorizing Restorative Justice. That was just a really, really great opportunity to sit in, and that was one that Belinda was one of the speakers.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, it was called Colorizing Restorative Justice.
Colorizing.
Yeah. So that was Belinda's group that she was with, writing some chapters for a book that they had all put together, and I got the chance to have dinner with this group of people the night before, and it was just amazing to sit in this room with like so many bright people who have so many different and valuable experiences, and I'm sitting there like, I can't say anything that compares to anything that been saying here in this room. So it was just really, really special to be able to do that. And the next day during my talk, we had probably like 50 plus people sitting in on that circle, just there to listen to what all these speakers had to say. And it was great to hear that perspective as well. And you know, the speakers talking about how that's not something that's been kind of considered in this work. So it was good to get that group of like-minded people together and speaking about their experiences.
So I pick up a little bit with Miles and I went to the same conference, so in Denver again. And just a few highlights for me. There were a couple things, breakout groups that I sat in with Miles because I couldn't get into others. 1,600 people showed up, and the attendance, I mean, we were just all over the place, but it was absolutely amazing. But a few things that really stuck out to me about this conference, and anyone who's interested in the work of restorative justice, I would encourage you to go to their website, the National Association for Community and Restorative Justice. It is a membership organization, and you can be an individual member, but they have a wealth of information, so that was a clear benefit. I personally am a member, and just the hub of information they have on this work, I think is just incredible. But the conference really confirmed that this is a movement. It's not a moment in our time, in our history. Restorative justice is not brand new. It's deeply rooted in indigenous people and in practices. For some reason, we veered away from it, and now it's coming back. So it was amazing to see this wealth of people, very diverse, age, race, ethnicity, ability, professional, sexuality. It was just so, like and it happened to be Pride weekend too when we were there. So it was just so many different people. The diversity was so rich and almost overwhelming. But it was a confirmation that the DRC entered into a space of restorative work at a time where this movement is really taking off across the country. So I am personally very proud at our bravery in being willing to step forward in that way. Another thing that I think becomes a program-oriented aspect of the DRC's work, as I complain about very often the number of reports that I have to provide to our State Court Administrative Office. I'm in that reporting application process right now as we speak. Our application to even continue our work next year is probably going to be about 40 pages long, and I report about 28 reports a year. It's a lot of reporting, and I love to let people know that this program requires a lot of energy. But one of the data points that I report on is the duration of a session, be it mediation or circle. How long are we in session? And our numbers are good because we have small claims that offsets a lot of stuff. But it was an interesting dialogue in hearing all of these practitioners talk about what is a quality session. Is it efficiency and time? Or is it the storytelling, the listening, and all of the work that we do as practitioners to help people get to a place that they can resolve their problems and have a sustainable outcome? And that is a conversation that I am having with the local stakeholders around diversion, peacemaking, and all of that right now. We really have to help shift our system and our way of thinking about what makes sense when we take people in a room and close the door, be it a mediation, a peacemaking circle, or whatever. My approach has always been to not pressure you all to hurry up and finish. I don't knock on the door. There are programs where they knock on the door and say, time's up, wrap it up. They do that in a small claims case or otherwise. We didn't do that because we recognize that people need time to process what's happening, and we should give them time to get where they need to be in terms of a conclusion. But it was good to hear that this idea of efficiency is being grappled with in the work of restorative justice. Miles mentioned the things about being a victim focus. I think that is very important as we're entering into this space of diversion and victim offender conferencing. I think what we have put out has been very helpful, but how do we strengthen our side of victims entering to this space? So now we see an opportunity to strengthen the program just from a victim's perspective, giving them something that giving them an opportunity to engage in our work in a way that makes sense for them, for their safety and their comfort. And I don't think programmatically we've thought that way before. We want to help defendants. We want them to learn from their mistakes. All of that is important, but we need to expand that narrative and make sure we have a space for victims. We do a great job with storytelling, and a lot of what we experienced was storytelling from students out of a school district in New York. They told stories. Indigenous people were there. They told stories, so that was great too. And just to kind of round out where Miles left off, a book is coming out that's called Colorizing Restorative Justice.
Can you spell colorizing? Is it coloring?
Yep, color,
Okay.
I-Z-I-N-G. It's being published by Living Justice Press, which is in Minnesota. They're in the editing, maybe the final stages of editing right now as we speak, and I am one of the authors of the book. Each writer is a person of color, which is why we call it Colorizing Restorative Justice, because in the literature around this work, there are not authors of color. We are the workers very often, we're the practitioners, but we've never had space to write our experiences, or even for those who might be doing research and writing and all of that. So this publisher has created space with us with this project. So the authors, many of the authors were there, not all of us, but many were at the conference, and we did a breakout session just to talk about this journey of writing about the work that we do. I thought a few people would show up, especially Miles, since he was with me. But we had lots of people to show up, and it was just a very emotional moment that space is being, we do this work that we say is very inclusive, and people of color, our voices have not been included in setting direction, in confirming, in creating new paths and pace for how this work looks. So for the first time, now we are seeing, or we have a space where that can happen. And I'm very happy to have vet these people. I have vet 25 practitioners across the nation, including in the world, including Canada and London. We have been video conferencing for 2 years, almost 2 full years, working on a book and contributing articles for what is to come. I'm hoping I will have it by January or so, and we'll certainly have a copy available at the DRC for people to take a look at. But I write about the work that we've done in schools and how do we make our restorative circles as inclusive and community focused and supportive as possible. So everything that we've been doing as a peacemaking circle, I wrote about that journey and experience in the book, and why we have to really question ourselves as practitioners that we're doing circles not for ourselves, we're doing it for the people who are in our circles. This is has to be our gift for them, and we have to set these circles up in a way that appeals to them and that will support their needs. So how do we shift our thinking about, is it about me, or am I doing it with them? That's sort of the crux of the article that I contributed, so more to come on that.
Okay, I told you there's going to be a lot of information, right?
Just the publisher again.
Living Justice Press.
We're doing well on the timing, so we will have time for all your comments. I was lucky to get to go to Tucson, Arizona for the Association of Conflict Resolutions Conference, which was named this year Healing the Divide, Peacemaking in a Divided Society. we got there, and one of the first people I met was from the FAA. He does conflict resolution with air traffic controllers.
Wow.
He says, I don't go to the towers. And then another person was from the Air Force. So it was like this just broad group of people in conflict resolution. I want to tell you about 3 different workshops that I went to. One was about culture and how it impacts negotiations. The second one was about comparing attorney versus non-attorney mediators. And the third one was taking a fresh look at conflict resolution for elected bodies. The one about culture had a couple of, they made statements that you can agree with or disagree with if you want to, but they said, like, in Japan, culture impacts negotiations because in Japan, having strong emotions is embarrassing. You're nodding your heads, okay, good. In Israel, people are very emotional. And I love the other one. In Ohio, people are very polite.
That's Minnesota, that's the Midwest.
They talked about gender-based differences. In each culture, there are gender-based differences. And in the United States, women are better in negotiating for other people than they are in negotiating for themselves. So these are things to think about if you have people, men or women, in your mediations or your peace circles, and to think about when you have people from other cultures. They also talked about flexing your style. Some of this we do really easily and well because it's part of what we do, but some of it I think is important. Come with an open mind and heart. Don't give or take offense. Err on the side of formality and courtesy, particularly if there's someone of a different culture. Be attentive and ask questions. The next one about attorney versus non-attorney mediators. There was a woman there who decided she wanted to take a look at all the research that's been done about the difference between attorney and non-attorney mediators, and she found nothing. She looked and looked and looked, and she said there's no research about that. So she decided to do research about it. So she looked at 12,701 cases in Atlanta. And what she did as to take a look at success or non-success was the settlement rate, the satisfaction rate, and the comparison of ethics complaints. Those were her 3 criteria. What she found is that there was no difference between the 2.
Oh, wow.
She said, behavior makes a difference. And the most important behavior is listening. She also said the other thing that made a difference was the number of cases a person had mediated. If you have mediated between 0 and 50, your success is unpredictable. If you have mediated between 50 and 100, it begins to coalesce. And over 100 cases, you're more likely to be successful. 100.
Wow.
I know, I thought, how many of us have any idea whether or not we've done 100?
Practice makes perfect.
Practice makes perfect. Yeah. How do you get to where you go? Practice, practice, practice. The other one was a wonderful workshop that I went to called Taking a Fresh Look at Conflict Resolution for Elected Bodies. One of the things she entertained us with is all the different things elected bodies do to each other. And she said, I often work in small towns. I think she's in Minnesota. I often work in small towns. And she said, the commissioners, his wife turned me down to go to the prom. So I don't like him. And so you've got all of these ancient histories that you're working with. And she said what she needs to do is she needs to move people from the traditional approach of conflict, which is to win. The participants are adversaries. I thought this is really important when we think of what we try to do in mediation. Participants are adversaries. Both the people and the problem are attacked. You assume there's a negative intention and you want to prove yourself right. These are the people who come to you. And she says, whereas what I want to do is move them to a problem-solving mindset before we can begin to get it going. And she says the goal, instead of to win, is a wise outcome. The participants are not adversaries, they're joint problem solvers. You attack the problem and not the people. You presume positive intent, and you want to understand the other's positions and interest, and you commit to listening with curiosity. I also like the last thing she said, here are tips for synthesizing. I thought these might be helpful to us. So as you're synthesizing something, you say, here's what I've heard so far. The common thread seems to be, here's how I see the connection between all that has been said and what's really important seems to be. I thought those were kind of interesting ways of synthesizing. So, again, too many workshops. So it was so hard to choose. And other things I would have loved to have told you about is the borderlands, where the tribes, one tribe is on both sides of the Mexico-United States border. It was a tribe that used to go up to Wisconsin, to Oregon, and now when they cross the border, they're treated like, you know, a citizen of one country or the other, and they're just going to see their aunt the rest of them.
Okay, so I went to a conference in Chicago called Upswell, actually just a few weeks ago in November, around nonprofit development. So I was thinking yesterday, like, who really wants to hear about nonprofit development? It can be really tedious and kind of boring. But it was actually really interesting to me. Another very big conference, just like the Denver one, about 1,500 people. I had been to the one in Detroit 2 years ago, and it was amazing. So when I saw that it was in Chicago, I'm like, great, I can just drive there. And it was in the Sheraton. It was right downtown on the Magnificent Mile. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. And again, way too many things to choose from. But I think what they did, the way that they set this conference up is, I don't know if anyone has heard of unconferencing. So they intentionally try to make it not a traditional conference, and so they do a lot of these breakouts, and there was a lot of like meditative spaces for people, like if you got too overwhelmed, you could just go to a quiet corner and literally just lay on the floor on a yoga mat, and they had, you know, music in the back, you know, like you're at the spa or whatever, to just sort of like get away, because these conferences can be so, while they're really energizing and it's great to hear all these ideas from your, you know, counterparts throughout the country or throughout the world. Actually, this conference is international, so people were from all over the place. But yeah, I mean, while it's energizing and you get all of these ideas and hear about all these different innovations and these programs that are happening, it can be really exhausting, right, at a certain point. And so what I thought was really cool about this conference was that weaving of all those meditative spaces and conversations about self-care were really important. And I think all of you as, you know, practitioners in mediation or peacemaking, I think that's really important as well, right? Because you're in these very intimate and personal spaces in people's lives, right? It's emotional and a lot's going on, and you're hearing about people's experiences, whether good or bad, probably I'm guessing mostly bad, right? And that can be hard to process, you know, for you guys as well. So I think that they, that this conference recognized that people who are in mission-driven philanthropic work do a lot of hard work, right? And so it can be really draining, and even secondary, you can even get that secondary trauma, right? And not recognize that that's what you're going through. And so there was a lot of conversation around how do we help each other, how do we create those spaces of self-care within our organizations, both from the funder perspective and the nonprofit perspective. I think we do, at the DRC, I think we have a very healthy work environment. I think we all work really well together, but I've been in spaces where it can be really challenging and it's difficult, and you have to work really hard at trying to figure out how to make things work, right? I'm sure we've all been in those spaces at one point in our lives. But so that was really, I think, sort of good, not good to hear that people are going through a lot, and it's hard to process everything that's been going on, either whether it's on the local level or the national level. But it seems like everybody is at a space or at a place where we need a little bit of healing, right, to happen. And how can we bridge a lot of conversation of how can we bridge those divides as well. The other sort of trend that I saw too was where it seems like a lot of these conferences that are available to touch on inclusion, diversity, or what diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so the funders are actually changing that within their own organizations as well, and how they give. So they're looking at trying to support marginalized communities or programs who help vulnerable communities, and also organizations who are led by people of color and who serve people of color. Because they recognize that there has been some bias and discrimination with the funding landscape throughout the country, which I've sort of noticed in Washtenaw County over the past 10 years, and it was kind of affirming to hear that that's also happening in other communities throughout the country. It's not just a Washtenaw County problem, it's a nationwide problem, right? So they're being funders are being very intentional about helping specifically communities of color, organizations who are led by leaders of color, and actually don't necessarily want the data. It's not data driven. It's, we want to actually help somebody get started. We know they're not going to have the data. They're not going to have the outcomes, the measurements, all those things, with grant funding and grant writing that they all want. But they want, it's basically like, okay, I believe in you. I believe in your mission. I believe in your work. Your values align with our values. Here's 50 grand to get started, right? And the other component too that is also seems to be trending is long-term investment by funders. Not just, here's 50,000 for 1 year and you're done. It's how about, over the course of 3 to 5 years, understanding that it takes a long time to get a lot of these programs started. So, and what did come up a little bit, so restorative justice wasn't quite in a lot of these conversations, or even people that I ran into who are in the work with conflict resolution or ADR practices or restorative justice work, although some of them do use those approaches, not very many organizations, which is interesting, that actually focus specifically on restorative justice work. But I started to hear a little bit in conversation. So the funders, I think, are, because it's such a long-term investment and there isn't the impacts, can be, is years, right? That they are, I've got 1 minute. I haven't even touched on everything. I wanted to actually get into
We've got
story.
a little extra time.
Okay. Now I lost my train of thought. But
Long-term
the funders, so the funders, so they recognize the long-term investment in a lot of this mission-driven philanthropic work, and so are being very intentional about how they're giving funds and who they're giving funds to. So that was good to hear, and I really appreciated that. But little murmurings of restorative justice, specifically around diversion, juvenile diversion work. And I think the reason that funders haven't, what it sounds like funders haven't reported, is because, so they've already kind of gotten to a point where, they are on a different course in their life, and so it's hard for them to justify putting money into these programs because of maybe they'll fall back into these old patterns or these behaviors or something like that. So it's too much, they've seen it as too much of a risk, but are definitely, they're talking. So I think this is just starting to filter into the funding world around juvenile diversion work and supporting restorative practice programs specifically. So maybe we'll see more opportunities in the future for the DRC and other organizations like the DRC. So that was good to hear, although kind of sad to see that there wasn't as much representation in this conference. Of course, I didn't meet all the 1,500 people, but at least in the sessions that I was in, nobody was doing this kind of work. So, but yeah, so those were kind of the trends as far as nonprofit development work and where funders are. And then, so a lot of the, so there were hundreds of things to choose from. But I really wanted to focus on storytelling, and I know we've got some storytellers in here as well, and I think it's really important because, especially in this type of work, since it's so heavy, the way that I see it is that you guys are all a part of or a piece of somebody's life story that you're helping, whether it's through mediation peacemaking circles, right? And so how do we capture that as an organization so that we can give voice to everybody that we interact with and are helping in the community, right? And how do we get folks in the community to recognize and to see the impactful work that we have in our community? And so, so one of the sessions that I went to was with StoryCorps, which is directly affiliated with NPR, and it was really moving. And they have they've taken these Airstream buses and they're going around the country and they're collecting stories. And so they want to deploy these buses like all over the place, and they want to have, with each community they go to, they want to have a specific theme. And I was thinking, well, they could come here, and maybe there's a way that we could tell a story around restorative justice and the impact that's having in our community, whether it's through the peacemaking board, the circles, and mediation, and ADR practices, and maybe victim offender conferencing. You know, maybe there's an opportunity, you know, to do that. But, you know, of course, I'm thinking all these grandiose ideas, you know. But maybe we can get them here. But it was really powerful to hear, I mean, because so StoryCorps, for those of you who aren't familiar, they get two people together in like a little tiny room or a sort of a makeshift room. And it's two people of opposing viewpoints, whether it's political or whatever it is. Maybe it's a daughter and a father who have had a falling out in their relationship, and they just put two people together to just talk. And what really comes out of it is that people actually really do like come together, and then they realize that, you know, oh, maybe I was, you know, I had all these assumptions about you that weren't true, right? And so it really bridges those relationships, what I think is, you know, all the work that you guys are doing too, right? Everybody in this room is doing is trying to repair, you know, repair the harm and repair those relationships with the people in their lives. So, so I think that StoryCorps really lends itself to being maybe some sort of a way how we can tell the DRC story and, you know, in our community, and, you know, and raise that consciousness and awareness level here around how, you know, restorative justice changes people's lives, right? Like, you know, very directly. So.
And you got some toys.
Oh yeah, well yeah, so I put this here, so I thought this was, so they had these on the tables, and I thought these were really good questions. So, let's see. So these are some of the questions I think that they've posed to people, and like, you know, to give an answer and upload. So they have an app too, by the way. So you can just tell us.
You extra time. So.
Yeah, sorry. So question to ponder, right? You know, what are you most proud of? How would you like to be remembered, right? What are your dreams for the future? You know, when did you first fall in love? You know, I mean, you know, these big questions, right? These like sort of life-changing questions. I thought these could also be really great for peacemaking circles too, which also I know Miles got some really cool stuff at the Restorative Justice Conference too. Yeah, that I know you guys can look at later. But yeah, so you guys are welcome to look at any of this stuff that I got from the conference.
And Miles reminded me that the publisher had this, and this is the cover of the book that I mentioned. So I can pass this around. It's called Colorizing.
Yes. And we said we wanted a half an hour.
You may pass that around to
Yes.
us? Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to take
So
pictures.
I encourage using Living Justice Press for those who are collecting books around.
We said we wanted to have a half an hour for questions, and look at our time.
Perfect. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn.
Oh, I guess
Yes,
to
thank
start
you,
here
Carol.
or around, I don't know.
I think again, and the whole time I'm thinking that how can I be part of these conferences, or is that a way for us as participate in a conversation, or just for people?
So the capacity building grant was for the center. We used some of those dollars to support the staff in going to conferences. But generally speaking, these conferences seems to be biannually. So the Restorative Justice Conference will be in Chicago in 2021. They've already announced the date. If you go to their website, the dates are announced. I think the location has even been identified. This will be their 8th maybe the 8th conference that this organization has had. It is amazing. I'm hoping to go again, and Chicago we can drive, so. But it's a great experience to be in so many topics, so many people, in ways to think about the work that we do.
I told Belinda she should go to the ACR conference.
And the
She's
ACR,
gonna
is
be
it
in
next
Florida.
year? Is it next
It's
year?
every year.
Yeah.
So-
So it's the
ACR
ACR,
conference.
the Association for Conflict Resolution,
The
is
one
an
that I-
annual conference, and it's going to be in Florida next year. So those are membership organizations as well.
So if you become a member, one of those, then you get the
You get the information.
And you can get the information, yeah.
Kathy, you had a question?
Yes, I think this is for Miles. You said that you went to a domestic violence and restorative justice breakout, and I wanted to talk to you about that, because I heard some people won't do those cases, and did they talk about
Exactly,
anything
yeah.
special about that kind of restorative justice?
They kind of did, yeah. I have a little bit of notes from that still. But yeah, that's something I wanted to go to just because I have been interacting with a lot of the victims of domestic violence that were calling and wanting to use mediation or restorative services. And, you know, it's definitely a touchy thing to do, to put somebody in that situation. So I was hoping I could get some information from that talk. And they had a panel of people to talk to us. I think there was 2 judges and maybe 2 women that were running a center where they were doing circles for victims of domestic violence. Let's see here if I can find it. There we go. So, yeah, they said obviously start with a person, or they said that you should start with a person who was violent, not with a person who violence was against, which was interesting, and, you know, really working hard with that person to get that, and put them with a circle of support that can get them to understand, you know, the actions they made, and you know, why they're in the position they're in. Then let's see what else I've got here. So yeah, and then they talked a little about just training facilitators and mediators on things to monitor during the circle, you know, so you can keep the circle safe and things like that. I don't have a ton of notes, but yeah, it was an interesting panel.
Did they ever say, like, have them separated by a screen or over the phone? Or
No, they didn't say that particularly. It was literally, yeah, putting people in the circle, but it was a lot of separate work. And then I think once people were ready to go ahead and bring together, then they do that.
Yeah.
Set up the space for that to happen.
And I'll add to that, right now in Michigan, our court rule addresses domestic violence for domestic relations mediation. There's some talk in the Lansing office about using that approach for all cases and doing that assessment. But the court rule indicates that if there is violence and it's an unbalanced relationship, you don't proceed. But we are seeing on the restorative side work that is being done with victims and offenders of violence that are coming together. In some communities, indigenous communities, even sexual assault is addressed in circle, maybe not immediately following the incident, but at some point they will have it. And a lot of pre-work, it may be a years long of pre-work in getting folks ready for that session, but it's being done. So I don't know how things will, if things will even shift in our court rule, but we have to, as the center, we have to take that into consideration.
So that means you can't do it now?
Right now, we can't. Not as a CDRP.
One thing I'll just, once we wrap up, I'll look up the name of the center that those women from the panel were on.
Oh, yeah,
I'll
I'd like
share
to know.
that with you, because they have some information on their website about what they're doing.
Miles, in that session on engaging victims,
Yeah.
did they have any good ideas about how to get victims to buy into this, particularly when they're being represented by prosecutor's
Yeah.
office victims?
Exactly. So that's the thing that they were talking, kind of hitting on, and that I felt, we've been experiencing as well, is we don't have access to those people, and how we have to gain access, and that is through educating the prosecutors, the victim advocates, and people over there that are shielding the victims from you know, the different processes. So that's kind of where it all has to start, is just getting in those ears and letting them know. And, but also maybe taking some experiences of victims that have been able to go through this process and say, this was really important to me, and I think it needs to be, you know, offered up to more people if that's something that can help get that conversation going. But yeah, it's just been difficult to access the people right now that we need to be accessing, and that's where, like they said, it's got to start there so that it can proliferate out from that point.
So, and was there acknowledgement that it's often the prosecutor's office that is protecting the victim?
The victim advocate, yeah.
Yeah.
The victim.
Yeah, I went to that breakout session too and spoke with a gentleman from the Impact Justice Group out of Nashville. And they are doing this work pretty well, victims and offenders coming together. And what he said, and he was a strong advocate for being victim-centered. And he said one of the things we start this process on is asking the victim what level of participation would be meaningful to you. So starting the conversation with the victim, finding out where they're comfortable and how they want to move forward. His experience indicated, and this gentleman had been a probation officer, he was a law enforcement person for a while in his career, a probation officer for a while in his career, then joined this organization, Impact Justice. He also said that victims often have lost their sense of control because they were victimized. So doing things that help them feel that they're getting back their control. So even the questions of where you want to have the meeting to happen, how the room is set up, who should be there to participate, in working with them on what kinds of questions as a facilitator do you want me to ask. So really working in partnership with victims and getting them to feel some sense of ownership and control of the process is a way to be focused on the victim and to get them better engaged. But to Miles' point, our first hurdle is getting to the victim, him or herself. And how do we, so can, what we've learned and what we're going to continue to research when we think about the victim offender program and the delinquency, how do we engage victims advocates in this way too, so that they can trust the process and know that we're not looking to further harm the victim.
Do we know what the victim advocate, how they identify their job, what they're trying to accomplish?
At this, I don't know. I'm sure they know. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
Like the ones
And it
that
feels like,
prosecutors are.
from my experience, it feels like the victim's advocate keeps victims informed of the judicial process as well.
And
Like
then
protect.
protect.
And they protect, and they keep them informed of how the process, what to expect, the next step, and those kinds of things. I think what I'm thinking about is how do we go a lot deeper with a victim. Yeah.
Expand their.
And expand their,
concept.
yeah. Carolyn did Kevin.
So I was interested, the population, 1,600 people, do you think any of them were prosecutors or police?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the breakout groups I went to was very police-oriented. In fact, some community in Colorado, their police department did a breakout group that was an add-on to the conference, and I had to leave. I had to get back home, and I couldn't stay for it. But we have police officers there. We have prosecutors. Adam Foss kicked the conference off. He was a district attorney. A woman out of New York who was setting up, she wasn't a public defender, but she was setting up a defense organization in New York that will provide defense counsel to offenders, but from a social service perspective. Like if they're homeless, if they need, we have a food pantry, clothing pantry, we've helped them find shelter so that they can show up at court and go through that process. So there was some very, what was so intriguing for me, many things were intriguing, but one of the great takeaways that sticks with me to this day is knowing that people who were trained professionally for this system can be restorative if they allow themselves to be. So we have public defenders, prosecutors, judges, lawyers, people who were trained for an adversarial process, who have somehow come to this place where they say what we're doing really isn't keeping communities safe. We need to do more. And they were, a couple of them were like the I don't know, the like keynote speakers and things like that. So we heard quite a bit of that. Yeah. Can we go to Kathy? She had a question, then we'll go back around.
Well, no, I already had one question.
Oh, you did? Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was just, on what you just said, funny thing. It would be wonderful if we can capture that and then think about interviewing some of those participants when we go to the conference.
Okay. Yeah, it would be great if we could get one of them here, huh? Yeah, speaker, yeah.
So I would just like to tell Germaine that I love this idea of getting StoryCorps here, and I'd be willing to help you do that.
Okay.
Me too.
So I was going to talk about the StoryCorps because actually a lot of StoryCorps talent is not in restoring justice and harmony, it's in recovering memories. Like a lot of StoryCorps telling is talking to people who are veterans, who won't be around anymore, you know, to get their experiences. So, I mean, we would have to do a lot of tweaking to get, you know, two people to reveal the story of another, you know, because it's only really about one person. The other person is just sort of interviewing that person. So we have to do a lot of tweaking. It could be done, but I am glad that Kathy is interested. She's very imaginative. She'll figure out how to tweak it.
Yes.
Miles has a story, Miles has a story that I want him to tell.
Just on what you said,
Yeah.
the African American community of Washington County here have done that, and so I mean, Ms. Hunter would, and if you reach it, because they've done that, and they've been doing it for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to connect with them,
Yeah,
and
for
they
sure.
give you some pointers.
Yeah, I think little programs like that, like throughout the country, are in a lot of different communities. I think StoryCorps, what they're trying to do is create a national archive
Right.
of specific social
Exactly.
points in American history.
Mhm.
And I think they have something, I think they said like 45,000 stories already and counting. So that's why they have the app, because you can just upload your story wherever you are, right? So you don't have to contact them, there's no application process. Seems like it's a pretty easy process. So yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yeah, what Sally wanted me to share was that it kind of ties into this conversation. When I was home over Thanksgiving break,
Miles, could you project a bit
yeah,
more?
when I was home over Thanksgiving break, my mom had tasked me with writing a question for my grandparents, and that I guess my aunt sent out to the rest of the family and wanted everybody to write down some questions for our grandparents. They're going to respond to those questions, and then she's going to put a book together to send out to the entire family. So it's something like that, yeah, which ties into the StoryCorps and those questions on there too were excellent.
Kathy.
This is not really a question. I'm just thinking about time. So maybe we spend more time processing on the front end, and I'm not even thinking about recidivism and stuff, but in the traditional system, they're going to give you a punishment pretty quickly. But then there's all the stuff of either you're going to be incarcerated or residential treatment for a while, which is very time intensive, employs all those jailers and correctional officers and all the checking to make sure that they're complying. And even the victim advocate, it seems to me that we're taking over some maybe all the job of the victim advocate. So there's that trade-off, and maybe the victim advocate's a little bit worried about that. But I think the victim advocate probably still has a job because not everybody's gonna go to restorative justice. But those who want to go to restorative justice, we would be taking over as victim advocate, I would think.
Possibly,
Some thoughts.
possibly, good thought. Yes, ma'am.
Well, following up on that, how efficient should you be during the process of mediation or victim offender conferencing? An interesting dynamic develops between the co-mediators. Some co-mediators want to be time efficient, and other co-mediators, like me, don't have any time limits. I can stay till tomorrow, if you can stay till tomorrow type of thing, you know.
Joanna, you do.
So the whole point, I think, for us, the relevant point for us about time and efficiency is because as co-mediators, we really might need to have a conversation about it, which I think we might not have had.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think institutionally, we are all programmed about time. Everything is time-oriented. And it's just one of the things that I have learned to contend with. You know, even in schools, when we were doing the circles in schools, they wanted them in 15, 20 minutes. Yeah. This kid has been acting out for 2 months, and you want us to fix the problem in 15, 20 minutes. So it's just something that we have to rethink about efficiency, time, and multitasking. I think it all goes in there to help people feel comfortable with when we go into the room and close the door, we're using that time well. And the outcome of that invested time is going to be a behavior change that can continue, right? So getting people to understand that and feel comfortable with that is a part of the selling aspect that we do in the office. Domestic relations cases, people will call, and I've taken calls and they say, well, how long would that take, an hour? No, please, no. And we have to help them really think about having voice and not being pressured and being able to talk openly and honestly and those kinds of things so that they can move away from their ideology around time and efficiency. So we do a lot of that for you at the intake stage. 2 hands went up. Huda and then Carolyn. Oh, Tom, I'm sorry. I didn't look that far over. Sorry.
Who are you calling on first?
Can we go Huda, Carolyn, then Tom? Is that okay?
I'll go back to something Sarah mentioned when you were talking about. You said racism is a white problem, but it is,
Well,
racism can have.
the reason it's said that way is because it was white people who made up the construct of racism.
Okay, then we should qualify it in this country.
Yes.
Because racism can be religious, can be ethnic, it can be, I am a victim of racism when I go home in Palestine, and it has nothing to do with the color of my skin.
Thank you.
Carolyn?
It's just going back to that efficiency thing. We know, like right now, for example, the jails are filled with people who don't get their cases heard. And it's just an odd thing that they complain about the time thing. And, you know, we want I have a friend whose son has been in jail now for 4 months because they're not hearing his case, you know, so it's a funny thing that they're talking about. So again, it goes back to education and having a discussion about what these things mean.
Yeah. Tom, I'm sorry, we didn't look over.
The section on small government, I think in mediation, was almost hysterical.
Tom was at the conference.
They were telling stories about what goes on in these little towns, and amongst the council meetings with the mayors, and it's just amazing the amount of conflict they have. One case I think was the mayor was not allowed to be in City Hall when the city council was meeting. He could only be on the telephone because as soon as the mayor appeared, all hell broke loose. And so it was just
And she told story after story. And I didn't write them down, but they were so funny.
It's really, but the other thing that struck me was, it's been a while since I've been at one of these conferences, how widespread mediation is. I mean, in every, it's just, when I first started to go to these conferences, mediation was kind of rare. But now it's everywhere, which is great. It's just really great.
I got a question or comment. I keep running into this thing of sort of, there's this fuzzy divide between work needed with individuals, often just to be able to prepare them to be able to do something like victim offender conferencing. And then there's the one-on-one or group work of circles and all that DRC is focused mainly on, I think. And I'm just wondering, all the individual work, is there anybody looking at trying to pull together that into a whole integrated process or anything, like including, I don't know if community mental health or something with trauma work is being talked about in terms of bringing it into this whole progression of, dispute resolution or relief?
Not to my knowledge. I would guess that people in these different organizations are beginning to talk to each other. That is happening in Washington County. People are sharing the same client, if you will, because people come with a whole host of needs, right? Even if they come through the DRC for the work that we do, they may have been in other agencies. And what some of this restorative work has forced us to do is to look at what other agencies is this person or family involved in, and can those other agencies be a part of what the problem-solving process that we're engaging this family in, particularly for these court cases, the delinquency cases. But to your point, there is not one group that is bringing everybody together, and which is, I think, makes sense and is important. When we think about our work tries to get sustainable outcomes and get to the root of the problem. And we have learned, and I think we've always known, even before restorative justice, even in mediation, we found that it was lots of things happening underneath the surface that led them, something happened that created a court case, but a lot of things were happening in the background. And we do our job so well, people open up and tell you all this other stuff, and we don't quite know what to do with it. So that has been a challenge, and I think it's becoming more of a challenge. So we're trying to connect with other organizations and let them know what we're doing and why we might be contacting them and that kind of thing. But to your point, having that consortium intact has not happened yet.
Elaine, you had.
I just have a comment. That Craig's comment and question made me think of years ago when we had Zena Zumeta here talking about her experience with conflict coaching with Tricia Jones at Temple University. And to me, so that's not a consortium of people coming together, but it's helping that one party understand what's going on in his or her world and coming alongside that to be a coach to sort of help them prepare for the next step or whatever that is. And I don't know, it might get us.
Miles and I went to something at Eastern and met a professor, I think. Sean Wolf.
Who's going to present at our March on conflict coaching.
Yeah.
March Brown.
Yeah, we think, I agree, we think that is a tool that will be very helpful in many of our cases. So we heard him, we thought it was great. He's going to come and share with us what conflict coaching looks like and how you can do it, and maybe that is something we can add on to some of the casework, because some people really need that support before their mediation or circle or whatever they do. They can use that support.
So
So I think that the circles of support and responsibility offer a model for that. For example, the state has tried to get them organized on a statewide basis. It hasn't happened yet, but in the 2 training sessions they had, they named a core group that would include the person doing the harm and the people supporting that person. But among the people supporting that person was the mental health worker, was social worker, was an advocate of one type or another. So the model is there. The model for involving all those people is there in that particular formation. And I think maybe Kathy could say more about it because she actually observed the group in Canada.
Yeah.
It's just circles of support and accountability.
Yeah,
I don't know about.
Joanne and then,
Oh, thank you.
Joan, I'm sorry,
That's
Joan.
okay.
Joan,
Okay.
then April.
I just want to make sure it wasn't Joanne. I just wondered, what is conflict, so could you tell us just what conflict coaching, it's a new term for me, is? Is that working with any,
I'm going to refer to
people?
Elaine because I can't bring the words together if you don't mind.
Yeah.
any 2 people who are having difficulty having a conversation?
It's one person. You know, it's actually, what I think of it as, and I went through the Tricia Jones conflict coaching program. It's sort of like one-party mediation. So you're working with one party. And you would not then mediate with that person because you have devoted, you have become more of an advocate in that sense for that person.
To
But
do
you're-
what for that person
To prepare to go to mediation or to go to
Oh.
a circle.
Yeah, how do they
or-
can think about
Or just take
conflict?
it on themselves as well.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
I saw a hand over here. Oh, April.
Yeah.
Yeah, then we'll come back to over here. Yeah.
I would like to mention that in March of this coming year, Allies for Change will be offering 3 seminars in different locations, doing our own work. One will be in Kalamazoo, one in Detroit, and the other in Cleveland, if you happen to have friends in Cleveland. And you can find out more at alliesforchange.org, or just contact me and I can put you in touch with you both.
Thank you.
Joe?
Yeah, conflict coaching is or can be a part of every mediation.
Yeah, I agree.
And at its simplest, it's no more than helping each party decide where they want to go and what kind of incremental steps they want to take in order to get there. So in that sense, it's not one-on-one advocacy. As a mediator, you're mutually partial, so you can be an advocate without sacrificing your neutrality. You could be an advocate for each side in helping whoever the person is find a way to get from point A to point B. And the amazing thing is, in so many mediations, whether commercial or not, very few people have really thought about what they really want and what it may take to get there.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it would be a great add-on, if possible, to our toolbox to be able to do that.
Absolutely.
Before we before, maybe you take a break and do some coaching and then bring them back together. It might even be a part of that, or adding that 3rd or 4th volunteer to the session. I don't know how it would look, but it feels like there's a space for it, and I wanted us to start learning about it.
So you're suggesting it could be quite quick if it's during the mediation and you're doing it.
I'm suggesting that we're going to learn about it. And see how it fits or not, but I thought it was worthwhile.
Joe was saying that we can even do it, even when we say like, it sounds to me like an apology might be helpful to you. You know, that could be.
Yes.
It sounds like a caucus.
Right.
Right, I was thinking the same thing.
At its simplest,
At its simplest, yeah.
very few people think about what their concession strategy is. You know, what are you What are you willing to give up that's going to be valuable to this other person, and vice versa? And thinking through that whole process.
So thank you all for your wonderful thoughts,
Thank you.
questions and comments.
Thank you.
Answer more questions if you have. And January 8th, Lisa Gottlieb will come back to talk with us about nonviolent communication and kind of what's new in that work. Okay. And feel free to stay if you want.